architecture as a creative expression will die if we cannot create conditions within which it can be meaningful. There's little sense in exhibiting paintings in a room that is pitch dark. It would be rather foolish for a virtuoso to play a violin solo on the runway of a jet airport. There's just as little sense in placing brilliantly designed buildings into an atmosphere of danger, noise, and fumes which an unworkable, hostile environment creates. We as architects, if we wish to create structures which can be enjoyed within and without, then we have to create before all else conditions conducive to their contemplation. As things stand today, our buildings are usually seen by only 3 men who look at them attentively: the architect who designed it, the architectural photographer through his viewfinder, and the architectural critic appraising its aesthetics. All others are kept too busy watching for traffic signals, for cars swerving out in, pushing from the rear, or watching for unrushing traffic from all sides when crossing the streets as pedestrians. It follows that we have but one choice: to use our energies, knowledge and talents, our imagination and our perseverance towards the aim of creating those environmental qualities in our cities, in our metropolitan regions, and out in the countryside, which will allow structures and environmental elements to serve best. Why have the environmental qualities of our urban and suburban areas deteriorated? What is the cause of the urban crisis, the existence of which is no longer doubted by anybody? The cause of this crisis is the time lag between rapidly moving developments in technology, science, sociology, and political systems on the one hand, and our lack of ability to adjust our thinking, our planning, and the implementation of such planning with respect to the physical forms of the public environment. We have been unsuccessful in adjusting ourselves emotionally, intellectually, spiritually to the advances, changes, and inventions of our time. The last 50 years have brought with them scientific and technological developments powerful enough to change our dictionary. New words like automation, atomic energy, television, jet propulsion, astronaut, intercontinental missiles, supersonic speed, and so on have been added to our vocabulary, signifying the impact of the changes on our daily lives. Sociologically, we are experiencing a population explosion, spreading of the wealth from the few to the many, mass production, mass consumption, shrinkage of the rural population because of technological progress in agriculture, and as a result of it and of the general population increase, explosive growth of population in metropolitan areas. New words have also been added to the vocabulary with regard to the development of metropolitan areas outside of the city cores. Suburban sprawl, freeways, cloverleafs are just a few of them. Significantly, the urban vocabulary itself has not been enriched. We are still working with the old terms of streets and squares, of slums and blight, of streetcars, buses, subways, and this stunted urban vocabulary indicates our impotence with regard to city life and urban culture. In our fast-moving times, there are only 2 choices: progress or retrogression. There is no such thing as standing still in the atomic age. If we are not able to improve the appearance of our city, we will have to face their disappearance. A disappearance not of the physical structures, nor of the political entities, but of urbia as a dynamic force in our culture and civilization, of its disappearance as an effective tool for implementing direct communications between people, as a tool for the exchange of ideas and goods, its disappearance as a cradle of human progress in all fields of human endeavor. There are today those who, because of the deterioration of the appearance of the city, are inclined to believe that its disappearance would be no great loss. who feels that in an era in which indirect human communications by telephone, radio, television has vastly improved, in a time when individual mobility by automobile has become possible, the city is no longer necessary, and that decentralization of human settlement in sprawling form over the countryside is a pattern of the future. There lives in this country a whole generation who, having never experienced the benefit of truly urban life, and having never seen a well-functioning city that means one of good appearance, wouldn't shed a tear if all our cities would disappear. This negative attitude about truly urban qualities is not just restricted to those who are downright hostile to the city, but has affected those who try to save it and who are working on plans for its reorganization. Their minds have become confused, and they are trying to help the city by imitating the sub-city or suburbia, by injecting into the urban body foreign and destructive ideas like low-density residential areas, mass transportation by private automobile, and compartmentalization of land uses. Suburban values and urban values mix as poorly as do water and fire. It is exactly this well-meaning but schizophrenic type of planning which may destroy Serbia. Because as a nation we have become wealthier, and because this wealth has been spread in a short 60 years from the thousands to the millions, we have attained as a nation many of the characteristics of the nouveau riche. And one of these characteristics is a concentration on egocentrically motivated raising of the private living standard, and as a side effect the neglect of the public living standard. This neglect of the public environmental qualities drives us even further into concentrating our efforts on our immediate personal surroundings. In escapist fashion, we are running away from the upsetting dangers and the ugliness of the overall environment, and the detached house, the private swimming pool, the fenced-in garden are expressions of this trend. We have taken over from the British and enthusiastically the slogan, "My home is my castle." We have gone a step further, however, and made it a fortified castle, fortified, with curtains to keep out the ugly vistas, with air filters to keep out the spoiled air, with front yards to move us away from the street, and we are trying to cut down all connections with the outside world, relying on the phone, on radio, television for communications. But here we come into conflict with the nature of man as a gregarious beast, and with economic necessity, at least for most of us, to earn one's living. We are forced to make sorties and forays out of our fort. Whenever we do so, we encounter the hostility and dangers, the ugliness, the chaoticism of the overall environment. And it goes even further than that. We find out that in some respects our fortifications, whatever we do, won't hold. Smoke robs us of the enjoyment of our gardens, and the neglect of our public environment creates catastrophes which our little fortress cannot withstand. Just think of the recent fires, floods, landslides which we experienced here. Our cities are not only dangerous, ugly and chaotic, they also fail in providing us with social and cultural inspiration. They have lost their meaning as urban centers. Maybe this was best expressed once by Gertrude Stein, who visiting Oakland, California, was asked how she liked it there. "There," she said, "there's no there." We as environmental architects have dedicated ourselves to the task of reshaping the existing and to the one of creating new human environments better able to serve the purpose for which cities were founded and have existed since historic times. The purpose of promoting the exchange of human ideas, the exchange of goods, promoting freedom of individual expression, and providing the greatest attainable amount of choice between solitude and privacy on the one hand and sociability and gregariousness on the other. From the consideration of these overall goals, develop a few conclusions. First, we should not desire to transform our anarchistic urban pattern into a dictatorial one. Though we believe that order is one of the basic prerequisites for any environmental organism, we do not believe that order alone represents a solution. Think, for example, of a large theater. It must provide order in order that people may be seated, so that aisles and exit doors are designed to avoid dangers in case of fire. It must have order on the stage with a well-engineered and designed stage equipment, lighting, and so on. But all this order would be useless if it is not activated by the creativity of the writers and performers, and if an appreciative audience is not assembled to echo the creativity. To bring about the type of order in the human environment which will not only make possible but encourage the creative performance of individuals necessitates the endowment of the man-made environment with a framework so designed that the greatest amount of variety and versatility can grow within it without exploding the frame. We believe it to be impossible to shape such a structural framework of the urban environment without full understanding and full appreciation of the three-dimensional expressions which will have to grow within it and out of it in order to give it content and life. Our insistence that there's a unity of architecture, engineering, and planning is a logical conclusion of this belief. We work in the fields of architectural design, interior design, graphic design, economics, and all types of engineering because we are convinced of the indivisibility of all these activities from each other and from the activity of design and planning of the environment. We are deadly opposed to specialization because it brings about inbred skills directed towards segments of the environment only and know-nothingness about the overall problem. We are steadily striving through actual work to learn more about the workings of many of the environmental elements, about office buildings, apartment houses, churches, museums, shopping centers, small shops, interiors, industrial plants, because otherwise our task as environmental architects would be removed from the knowledge of human needs, of economic factors, and would become sterile without this working knowledge. If we look back for a moment, we grew into the activity of environmental architecture by a process which time-wise and scope-wise follows a logical pattern. Until 1948, we worked nearly exclusively on the design of stores, shops, and interiors. Between 49 and 50, the scope of these projects grew and the first department store assignments came our way. During the war years before, however, when we had little to do, we dreamt of greater things. The Architectural Forum published an issue called 1940X, an article written by us in which we described a new post-war building type to come, the integrated shopping center. And in 1950 we got a chance to translate that dream into reality. Northland Center in Detroit, still regarded as one of the best, was our first. And it was our first chance to express our notions on environmental architecture. The principles which we on this project evolved still give direction to our work and that of many others. Foremost under the principles expressed in Northland is the separation of mechanical usage areas, roads, parking lots, trucking areas, service areas, from human activity areas represented in the pedestrian environment of the courts and malls. The creation of a strong architectural framework and our insistence, which was very much in contrast to others, for allowing within these frameworks individual expressions of storefronts, meetings, requirements, and tastes, even if they were not so good, of the individual store owners. Our insistence on filling the public environment of the pedestrian area with life and content. We always were against the slogan of grass on Main Street, and we regarded the environmental spaces between buildings as basically urban areas equipped for convenience with colonnades, rest benches, and enriched by planting flowers, and in Northland for the first time with the works of creative artists. And though Northland was a rousing success, we never looked at the planning of suburban shopping centers as constituting the final aim of our efforts. Northland was hardly completed when the Harvard Business Review published an article of mine in which it was stated that in our opinion the large suburban regional shopping center was basically a symptom of the urban crisis and not its cure. That it was, however, our hope that the impact of the planned regional shopping center would have a double effect. The one of shocking city governments and downtown interests into action, and the one of providing us with the experience and methods by which the problems of the downtown core could be approached. As a direct effect of that article, and that's probably the only time we could really find that there was a direct connection between an article and work, we were called upon to develop a plan for the revitalization of downtown Fort Worth. This project gave us an opportunity to translate the planning principles of the suburban shopping center into the urban vernacular. This effort, though it did not lead to the implementation of the Fort Worth plan, did lead us, as a firm, to dozens of large-scale environmental projects, and it had an acknowledged national and international impact with regard to city planning generally. Everything we have worked on since then, whether shopping center projects, building groups, plans for new communities, redevelopment plans, downtown revitalization plans, was a process of continuous seeking, learning, and experimenting, influenced by our first projects in environmental design, Northland, Southdale, Eastland, Fort Worth. After 12 years of working as environmental architects, I believe we are in a position to hammer our findings into a structure, a planning philosophy. But before I try to describe the tenets of what I see this planning philosophy to be, I would like you to widen your views beyond the consideration of the specific community which you know best, Los Angeles. This is exactly the same request which I always make when I speak to audiences in New York. I personally have the privilege and the problem of living and working in these two most extreme expressions of urban organization. The contrasts in urban character, the contrast in living, the contrast in working patterns are so great that it sometimes seems hard to apply the identical term city to both of them. Working in dozens of other cities, we realize, of course, that between these two extremes there lie the characteristics of the typical American city. In spite of being personally and immediately exposed to these contrasting patterns, I have found nothing to discourage my belief that basic attitudes about environmental design are applicable to the extremes and to the variations. The downward trend of our urban culture is due to two types of sins: sins of commission and sins of omission. Broadly speaking, the sins of commission consist of our actions to separate from each other all those urban elements which, if the city is to work, belong into intimate commingling with each other. The sins of omission consists of our neglecting to separate from each other those activities which disturb and destroy another. The sins of commission and the sins of omission are causally interrelated. We are separating activities which belong together from each other, because our omission to separate those which are disturbing to them makes it impossible to operate otherwise. Let me attempt to explain this paradox in greater detail. I said that we are committing the sin of separating urban elements from each other which belong together because they depend on each other. We are separating retail areas from residential areas, so obviously it is people who buy things. We are separating buildings serving cultural and artistic pursuits from residential and from retail areas, so obviously people would visit these institutions more frequently if they weren't far away from their residences, and so obviously the success of retail establishments would be enhanced by the shoppers' traffic generated by such institutions. We are separating working places, that is office buildings, whether they are governmental or private, high-quality industrial enterprises, from all formerly mentioned categories, thus forcing long and tedious trips to and from work. We are doing so in spite of the fact that through technological progress, most industrial activities have lost those disturbing qualities, smoke and smell, which in the early days of industrialization made this separation necessary. We are separating government workers from other workers, putting them into ghettos called civic centers, where they are removed from the life of the normal citizen and where they can meet only their own kind. We are doing so in spite of the fact that office work for the government is in character identical with office work for a private corporation, and that by doing so we are creating unnecessary trips for civic employees as well as for those who have to visit governmental offices. We are further separating by careful compartmentalization the rich from the middle classes, the upper middle class from the lower middle class, and all of them from the economically least successful. By doing so, we not only create a highly prejudiced society, but we are making it extremely difficult for those with higher incomes to obtain the services of those with lower incomes, and for those who render domestic services to reach their places of work. We are separating theaters and places serving cultural and recreational needs from all other categories, and by doing so we are not only isolating them from urban life, but we are also impoverishing the general city by extracting those facilities which would give it life and zest. To illustrate the degree and effect of this craze for compartmentalization, let us look in contrast to an older European city like, for example, Paris. Here the opera sits in the middle of a district devoted to retail, to residences and to government buildings. Going to the opera or leaving it, you enjoy window shopping, you have a choice of visiting hundreds of restaurants and cafes. A few steps from the opera you find large department stores and hundreds of specialty stores, from luxury shops to 5 and 10 cent stores. Above the stores and shops are residences of all types, luxury apartments, small apartments, hotel rooms. Dozens of other theaters, office buildings, governmental buildings are sprinkled all over the urban environment. The President's Palace fronts on one of the busiest shopping streets, and I have watched Monsieur de Gaulle comings and goings from the entrance vestibule of a little millinery store. The Academy of Fine Arts is surrounded by buildings which contain living quarters on the upper floors and bistros, cafes and antique shops on the ground floor. Whenever I visited the offices of friends or clients in Paris, I found right around the corner a wide selection of places where one could have a cup of coffee or a drink or a meal. Around the Church of the Madeleine, there's a flower market, apartment houses, and on the ground floor, again, stores of every description, including the most mouth-watering delicatessen stores. Some of the buildings contain elegant apartments, other cheap ones. The effect of this intimate intermingling is vibrant urban life admired by hundreds of thousands of American tourists who cross the ocean at great cost and walk their feet off in order to participate in an urban experience which has become a rarity in our country. Now, Paris is an old, organically and slowly evolved city. Now that it is exposed to the benefits of 20th century technological development like congestion by automobiles, frictions are occurring, and newer developments on the periphery are beginning to reflect the same spirit of separation and compartmentalization which we find. Western Europe generally, as an effect of its present prosperity, starts to show the effects of the sins of commission, which I touched on before. I say that the sins of omission consist of our neglect to separate those activities which have a destructive influence on human activities. This second type of activities can be classified as utilitarian and mechanical in character. At a time when these utilitarian mechanical features were less complex than they are today, we managed to remove them from the surface stepwise as urban civilization progressed. It is an earmark of a civilized city to remove its sewage from the gutter and put it underground. Likewise, the moving of telephone wires, electric wires, water mains, gas mains is accepted as good urban policy. Even when the railroad was invented, it took us only a comparatively short time to realize that trains on Main Street were an utter nuisance, and we removed their rails from sight, hearing, and smell. The advent of the airplane found us relatively well prepared, and so early airports were close to the city. Pretty soon we moved them to the outskirts. But one technological event has swamped us with such vehemence that we have surrendered urban life and urban values to it without a struggle. That is the advent of the rubber-wheeled vehicle, the private car, the truck, the trailer, as means of mass transportation. And their threat to human life and health, as the yearly figures of killed and maimed demonstrate, is just as great as that of the exposed sewer. Their disruptive influence on the street pattern is greater than that of the railroad train on Main Street, which at least operated on schedule. The suddenness of the attack by an army of machines, which growing at a faster birth rate than the human population, having now reached over 60 million, may explain in part our failure to act, as we did with regard to other utilitarian functions, but it doesn't excuse us from taking action now if we want to rescue our cities, which, because we have neglected the problem, are threatening to go to pieces. When I say pieces, I mean just that. When I described our sins of commission, I described our tendency towards a piecemeal pattern. The causal connection is obvious. Because we have not been able or willing to separate utilitarian mechanical functions and most of all mass transportation by automobile from human activity areas, we have had to adjust our human activity areas in order to serve the automobile. Nobody wants to live anymore above stores and shops because nobody can survive the disturbances which automobile and truck traffic engender. Working places which have to offer parking space for their workers must move into areas where they can provide such space at lower cost. So to an even higher degree, shopping centers and industrial plants. Families with children flee the melee of men and machine into the suburbs, and when they do so in sufficient numbers, they create the identical conditions in outlying areas and then flee even further, recreating the problem. People with enough money buy lots of land in the suburbs and exurbs in order to protect their lives, their health, and their privacy, and thus, depending on the economic status of the citizen, we experience suburban sprawl, neatly compartmentalized into subdivisions of varying lot sizes determined by the sizes of the paycheck. Retail organizations follow their customers, settling either in strips along suburban highways or in shopping centers. Metropolitan areas spread further and further, eating up landscape and countryside at an alarming rate until they flow together into an amorphous, disorderly, un-urban conglomeration for which the new name megalopolis has been coined. With the growing distance from the original urban core, it becomes increasingly difficult and inconvenient to reach it. Surrounded by blight and slum formation, it languishes economically, and there's a danger that our metropolitan regions will soon resemble gigantic donuts with all the dough on the outside and the hole in the middle. Our sins of commission and our sins of omission are inescapably interconnected. As long as we commit one of them, namely the one to fail to separate mechanical and utilitarian functions from human ones, we will never be able to stop the sins of commission, namely those of separating those human functions which have a logical affinity for each other. Any plan for the future of our cities which is not founded on the principle of attaining the highest degree of separation of all mechanical and utilitarian functions from human ones is half-hearted and half-baked. Let me prove this to you by discussing those qualities which make a core area a workable, livable, dynamic, and therefore economically successful one. Inasmuch as its function is to bring about the greatest ease and direct human communication, it has to be as compact as possible. In order to further the exchange of human ideas and of goods, it must have the quality of small-grained variety and diversity. If its aim is to bring people close together, it obviously must bring buildings close together, and it must therefore achieve greatest potential density. It cannot fulfill any of these aims if a large portion of its surface land is to be devoted to the storage of moving, stalled, or resting vehicles. Wherever we have made the attempt to provide sufficient space for the insatiable appetite of the automobile within downtown areas, we have converted them into places which, seen from the air, resemble bombed-out cities after World War II. Our city here, which has given its heart and soul to the automobile, has now instead of them a downtown area in which 2/3, and I have a fight with Harold on that, of the land is used as space for moving and storing tin, with only 1/3 remaining for buildings. Even Manhattan, which at least to a large degree is served by public transportation, has, thanks to the great efforts of its planners who concentrated on constructing bridges and tunnels to bring more automobiles in, been invaded by the metal hordes to such a degree that on Thursday, December the 28th, the Herald Tribune carried on its front page the headline, "The day New York almost stopped." And believe me, it stopped. The example of Manhattan makes it obvious that there is no possibility of compromise. You cannot have an efficient city core half separated and half unseparated. Removal of transportation facilities from the surface areas within active urbanized centers must be just as complete as the removal of the sewer lines and gas mains and water lines and railroad tracks. The answer to the mass transportation problem in urban centers can obviously be found only by applying technological means which will guarantee swift, convenient, and space-saving movement. Compromise between two solutions is usually worse than either of them. A compromise between public and private transportation follows this axiom. Private transportation has ruinous effects on the values which people coming to a downtown area seek. It destroys the stores, the buildings, and at the same time it bankrupts, through competition, public transportation, which then, in order to make ends meet, cuts steadily on quality and service. The pattern which develops in the case of such unnatural competition is usually that public transportation has to serve the masses during rush hours in the morning and evening and remain idle during other hours of the day, when private transportation by automobile still finds it possible to operate. This, as everybody who has tried it knows, is a hell of a way to run a railroad. It has often been stated that it would be impossible to get Americans used to the idea of traveling by public transportation. I believe that this is simply not true. It may be difficult to do when there is a choice, but consider the millions who use daily the public transportation facilities of high-speed elevators in office and apartment buildings, the escalators in department stores and banks, without raising an eyebrow. Now, of course, were we to introduce automobile ramps around these buildings and create a choice to drive up to the 50th floor, then we might run into trouble. We don't do so because the costs would be staggering. I submit that the costs of taking care of millions of automobiles in downtown centers is just as staggering and just as unreasonable. Without accepting the need for complete separation of utilitarian mechanical operational accessory facilities from the truly human activities as a non-compromisable prerequisite of any planning philosophy for the second half of the 20th century, there can, in my opinion, be no successful projection of urban development for the future. Once, however, it is accepted, wide and hopeful prospects open up. The separation of which I spoke can be attained in many ways. In the most compact areas it will have to be vertical. In less active areas it can be horizontal. In Midtown Plaza, in Rochester, it is vertical. In Northland, it is horizontal. However the separation may be accomplished, it will offer us the opportunity to correct our sins of commission. All human activities, whether they are residing or working, learning or relaxing, can be moved closely together, utilizing the space wasted up to now for mechanical uses, freeing the environment from danger and disturbance. There's one exception left over, and those are those working activities which, in spite of technological progress, are still obnoxious because of smoke or fumes. However, it can be predicted for sure that the number of such industrial activities will, with the progress of technology, steadily shrink. Because of the ability thus gained to move closer together, we will regain the chance to preserve landscape and countryside from being gobbled up by suburban sprawl. Variety is the spice of life. Our present urban pattern robs us of variety and of spice by covering the landscape and countryside with an amorphous conglomeration which is neither fish nor fowl, neither city nor country. The separation of utilitarian activities from human ones will equip us with tools for greater concentration and for the defining of dynamic urban areas and of setting them strictly apart from restful nature. Before we are able to apply the tenets of our planning philosophy successfully, we will have to rid ourselves from some deeply ingrown beliefs, concepts, and prejudices. Let me enumerate a few of them. We will have to throw overboard the prejudice that high density is in all cases a devil and low density is therefore in all cases angelic. Where low suburban density is arrived at by placing detached houses with useless side yards in land-wasting manner on a subdivision, it can be diabolic. High density, on the other hand, is a prerequisite for concentrated activity areas. Our greatest efforts, I believe, must go into the direction of inventing and developing methods of multiple land usage by which the highest practical density of the land can be obtained without infringing on the supply of air, light, mobility, and privacy. And here in the office, the project for Sydney and the project for Kansas City are just some examples of this multiple use. We must forget the idea that it is virtuous to separate human activities from each other, that it is bad, as the conventional planning books state, to let them encroach on each other. The encroachment is, if properly planned, is exactly what creates urban interest, variety, and dynamism, and ease of communication. Encroachment is the salt of the earth. The compartmentalized city is dull, unworkable, unlivable. The filing cabinet principle is not applicable to human life. We must throw away the old wives' tale that a free choice must be given everywhere to everybody between using land-wasting private transportation and land-saving public transit within highly developed urban areas. This is just like stating that there should be a free choice between making an honest living or stealing from society. Wherever land is in short supply, it is an irreplaceable natural resource, and misusing this resource is just like stealing immoral. I do want to repeat before closing what I mentioned in the beginning. I have not attempted to hand you an inflexible program for our professional efforts. What I was after is to establish a basis from which discussions, thought, and development may grow. But on one thing, I believe we can agree. Planning for the renewal of our languishing cities must emanate from the realization that cities are for people and not vice versa, and that therefore technology has to serve people and the city and can never be allowed to tyrannize them. Settlements which enslave and degrade humanity are not cities. They are for, or I wanted to say for the birds, but that would be unfair. Any self-respecting bird would rather become extinct than settle on the land spoiled by the human-made mess.